Good evening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present the 2021 proposed budget. Just for clarification purposes, we will be seeking any public comment after the presentation this evening. The purpose of tonight's budget is to provide the community with a summary of the 2021 adopted proposed budget in a format that's required by law, supplemented with clear and concise summary of the final budget. This budget shall afford our community current levels of programs and services for the projected enrollment were maintained. Costs were adjusted for factors such as collective bargaining agreements, inflation, and historical trends. It also implements our best understanding and projections of associated revenues and supports. Historical data and forecasting, the New York State enacted budget and released state aid are two examples. The property tax increase, including the debt exclusion of 3.76%, will not be exceeded. This budget and related programs and service appropriations are balanced with estimated revenues. We start the budget process around December, and we begin with a stakeholder group that consists of our administrators, our teachers, paraprofessionals, clerical staff, parents through PTSA, a community member that does not have students associated with the district. It's called our district planning team, and we begin the process by outlining guidelines that will actually shape our spending plan for the 2021 school year. More than ever, it is critical to have a budget that supports our students as we look at the 2021 school year with all of the uncertainties. At minimum, what this budget will do for us is to preserve our current level of programming. There are no increases in program. However, we feel it's imperative to preserve what we have in a time where our students are going to need support and assistance now more than ever. We have a budget plan that will allow us to be flexible, allow us to be nimble, and allow us to certainly adjust along the way, again, given these uncertainties. So as I look at the budget guidelines provided to the board in January, they reference high-quality professional learning. I would add within those bullets that professional learning will include a significant amount of training around remote learning, single-use platforms for ease of use for students and families, alignment of essential learning across grade levels and throughout departments, single repository for assignments, professional learning around grading and assessments being done remotely. Also will include a lot of scenario planning as we look at multiple options of what next year can look like. Essentially, we're preparing for and planning for readiness, not knowing which direction the governor or Monroe County will take us. When I think about maintaining fiscal stability now and into the future, the first bullet has proven very true and very important for us, allowing us to use reserves to protect and preserve our programs. Without the use of our reserves, we would have struggled not making significant cuts to a program. And again, feel strongly that our students need programs and opportunities now more than ever. This slide represents some of the acknowledgments of the educational value our school district provides our students and our community. I want to reiterate that the proposed budget is not growing program. It is positioning us to preserve program and to maintain our excellence. Should our budget not pass, we will need to cut close to $4 million, which you'll see later in the presentation. $4 million means people and program and opportunities for our students. And I do feel strongly that our third grade students, our seventh grade students, our 10th grade students deserve the same quality program that our graduating seniors and those before them have received. We've done a lot within our budget and accomplished quite a bit, and want to thank all of our residents and stakeholders for entrusting us with our budgets. Last year, we kept a promise of removing the one-time startup cost of full-day kindergarten, resulting in a budget-to-budget change of $144,000 or 0.11% approximately. During this time of more questions than answers, we have prepared a budget that provides for the normal, but it's also significantly flexible to handle the unknowns. Across budget lines, our budget managers will be able to shift funds based on the different scenarios that may be presented to us from summer throughout the course of the school year. Our healthy financial position places us at strong foundation to endure the implications of the pandemic and the New York State budget deficit. The goal is to provide for the usual while being flexible and nimble to prepare for what we currently do not know. A simple equation of the budget that's presented today is our proposed budget equals the 1920 proposed budget plus the net cost of programs minus the net of New York State enacted budget and the governor reductions and federal CARES aid. With that, I'm going to turn it over for the next several slides to our Assistant Superintendent Darrin Kenney and want to thank him for his work and that of his department during a time where there's been more variables than probably ever. Thank you.
Good evening. We're going to start with a high-level view of the budget and work down into the detail, and also go through some legally required aspects that we need to present for the budget per New York State law. First, we're going to start out with a summary format that the Board of Education and Community throughout the state are used to seeing, and that's by object code of expense. Starting out with salaries, about a 4.4% increase. This takes into consideration retirement attrition savings. All of our collective bargaining agreements, we know what they are for next year, as well as some enhancements that we did during the 2019-20 year in the areas of social emotional learning and behavior specialists, et cetera. That represents almost half of our entire budget, salaries do. Benefits for this year is actually a good news item. It's not as big of an increase as it's been in previous years. That's partially due to good performance of the retirement systems and the rates coming down. Our health consortiums for health insurance has operated very well, and the premiums are far below the market rates. So when you put benefits and salaries together, 77% of our budget is comprised right there, very similar to the 76% of our budget that's supported by the tax levy. So moving on down, equipment. The district does not spend a lot of money in equipment, percentage-wise, and it's a slight increase, and that's from some of the principals electing to forego some supplies and materials and shift it towards equipment-type items. Some of that has to do with addressing remote learning. Tuitions and contractual, that's everything from utilities to consultants that might have to come in, repairs to systems, et cetera. BOCES services. BOCES had some areas of pretty substantial increase, such as in special education. Other areas of BOCES have been decreases, so overall 2.8% increase there. Supplies and materials, and the reason it says aided, some of the supplies that we get we do receive aid, such as for textbook, library books, computer hardware and software. We're also required to share some of that money with the private schools that were within our borders, and that is based on a per pupil allocation. And you'll see the state aid on that when we get to the revenue side. Debt service and interfund transfers, you see a decrease there. That is because the 2003 large $106 million capital project, part of that was an energy performance contract. That borrowing is now coming off the books. We have a half a year payment during the 2021 year, and that is done. So you're going to start seeing that over the next few years. That project, some of the financing, we're going to be making final payments. So overall, the proposed budget is a little over $140 million, a 2.66% increase over the current year approved budget. Next, we're going to go into the three-part budget. This is legally required. It goes back to 1998 when New York State intended for districts to, across the state, to present their budgets in a consistent format and report that data to the state so that they can make certain representations. So starting at the high level, the three-part budget consists of what's called the administrative component, and it's basically the oversight and supervision is the best way to look at it. People that work for the district, they're not part of operations and maintenance, that are not directly working with kids on a regular basis. The program component is the opposite. Basically, it's anybody that provides services directly to our students. So previously in budget presentations, you're very used to seeing, for example, support services and transportation being a part of that. In this representation, transportation is part of program because they're providing services directly to students. The capital component is the debt service. It's also operations and maintenance. Those are the biggest components of the capital portion. The bar chart to your right gives a history of the composition, those three compositions of where they've been percentage-wise of our total budget over the years. And the program component has been right solid at that 75% mark, and our administrative component about less than 10%. The 75% is very favorable compared to looking at other districts across the state that are more in the 60 to 65% range. Drilling down a little, or looking at the trend as far as the actual expenditures and the types of things that are drivers. You can see that the program section is what's really driving the increases, and it's where the money is. Administrative is fairly flat. Capital has been flat with a slight decrease, as we previously mentioned. Administrative component, looking into it a little deeper. This would include the principals, for example, and their offices, so their office staff, the special education office at the central office. So again, special education is another area that's in two different components, both administrative and then the program piece. Instructional services, there's an increase there. Great investment into additional professional development and technology. We have plans for what we want to do with that. However, with the new time that we're in with the pandemic, that also gives us flexibility to use those resources for that, should that be necessary. Support services, which would include finance, human resources, technology, et cetera, central administration, and related benefits. And one of the nuances for the administrative component for the benefits is once, regardless of what component somebody worked in, when they retire, their health insurance benefits come out of the administrative component. So that's part of the reason why you see a big increase at the far right of that chart. We had a lot of retirements for the 2021 year. Program component, again, can't stress enough, think of it as if you know the position, if it's directly working with students, it goes into this section. So moving across, regular schools, that's where a majority of the money goes. Special education, some increases there due to specific services for specific students. Moving over to the support services and transportation, despite some increases in technology and human resources, transportation, we have a pretty substantial decrease. Part of that's because of our shortage of bus drivers. We've had to consolidate routes and make some changes, as well as we are slowly able to hire drivers. They are of lower cost. So we have some savings there, as well as fuel costs and diesel costs have gone down. So the benefits component of program is pretty stable, and that's a factor of when the people retire, their cost went to the administrative component, and the new hires coming in, they have to pay a bigger percentage of their health insurance as well as their lower cost. So things like Social Security and retirement system are lower cost. The capital component, operations and maintenance, that's solely in the capital component. That's a 1.5% increase this year. A lot of efficiencies from our capital projects as well as utility costs. We belong to a consortium of all the school districts in the county, and we buy our utilities through that consortium, and we get good pricing, and we've had very good performance in recent years. The debt service, you see a decrease there. That's because of the energy performance contract, the final payment. So our debt costs are starting to go down. In the next few years, you're going to see that go even more. That's part of the reason why the district has started talking about the level debt concept and possibly another capital project in a few years, and starting the planning for that so that we can maintain that consistent level. And then the employee benefits for that component are stable. The next required item that is the fiscal accountability supplement, and it's part of the school report card. If anybody wants to go on our website and look at the public budget document, there is a binder, what I call a binder, I'm old school, that the state requires us to do. Due to the pandemic, you won't be able to view it in each one of our school buildings or in the library as we're required to put it. The governor changed that law and told us to put it on the website, so you'll be able to find it there. One of the pages is the fiscal accountability supplement, and what it attempts to do is the state takes data reported to school districts, and it's 2 years old, the data, and it breaks it into per pupil cost for general education, special education, and then it combines it for the total district. Part of the reason why the total district almost seems to not make sense is because not every special ed student is special ed or general ed. Some students are both, so that kind of skews that number a little bit. It compares us to a similar district, similar demographics as far as low need, high academic performance, and then across New York State. In the general education realm, we compare rather well on all factors. Special education, we are on par with a similar district, and we're favorable as far as total students. When it comes to special education, in looking at it from a per pupil cost, it's important to remember that percentage-wise, we don't have a high percentage of our students that are identified as special education compared to some high needs school districts. So there's some economies of scale there, and that's part of the reason why the per pupil cost is higher in a low need district. So moving on to the revenue side, as far as how do we pay for the $140 million budget. In our district, because we are above average wealth by about 30% compared to the rest of the state, most of our budget is supported by the property tax levy. In our case, the levy is going up 3.76%. That is within the property tax cap. We talked previously about debt service. The voters back in 2003 approved that debt service. So as the incur the debt, the net effect of the debt minus the building aid on that is what is the local portion. So our state aid is going down because of the building aid coming out, as well as the pandemic. The governor backed out the federal CARES money, and that CARES money is down in the miscellaneous revenues that we will be receiving as a grant. And so state aid is going down almost 6%. Sales tax we've adjusted down. This year's been a banner year for sales tax right up until March. We anticipate due to the pandemic that's going to go down some, so we were adjusting that down. Same thing for interest. If you'd heard me talking to the board in the fall, I was talking about 2.5–3% on our investments. Now we're back down to the 0.5% range, so we've reduced that back. Fund balance and reserves. We have a number of reserves that are basically savings account for specific purposes as provided by law. We are using some of those reserves. The most recent of which, a couple of years ago, the state approved having a teacher's retirement system reserve, and we established that and started to fund it. This year, the rates for the teacher's retirement system are going up pretty substantially, so we are going to pull $300,000 from that reserve to pay for that increase. So good planning as far as thinking ahead and having money set aside for that purpose. We're increasing our reliance on reserves by a little over $1 million to help balance this budget. So the budget is in balance, 2.66% increase, and because it's within the property tax cap, a simple majority of the voters can carry the budget. Looking at state aid over time, this chart is a cumulative chart. So the bars did not represent how much aid we got each year. It's taking the year before and adding the current year. So the gold bars are what the formula says we should be getting in foundation aid, and the blue is what we're actually getting. And it's less for 2020-21 than it was for the current year. So we are approximately 52% funded. The average throughout the state is more like 65% to 72%, depending on which set of data you look at. So right now, the state, if you will, owes us, if they followed the law, we would get $92 million that they owe us. Real quick on the foundation aid, this goes back to a lawsuit campaign for fiscal equity that goes back into the early 2000s, where the Supreme Court ruled that the New York State's funding for schools was unconstitutional. It wasn't equitable. Schools didn't know in advance what they should get. They couldn't plan. So we were supposed to know 4 years in advance what our aid would be able to plan on that, and there was a distribution formula. Unfortunately, that's never really come to pass. To this day, it's still a political process. The formula changes each year based on that political process. There's what they call the shares agreement, where the handful of legislators and the governor go in a room and they make sure that certain regions of the state get at least certain percentages. New York City, for example, gets at least 60% of the aid increase. So the result is some schools are not getting what they should be, and we're actually to a point now where some schools are getting more than they should be, because the state, the formula is not taking into consideration enrollment changes, and in our case, it's not taking into consideration that we went to full-day kindergarten. So it's not weighting our kindergarten students as full-time students. So looking at our revenue composition over the years, and it also takes a look at our total budget, which has been a pretty stable increase and not as large as you might think, especially in the last couple of years. When we went to full day K, there was a bit of an increase in 17-18 year, or excuse me, 18-19 year. And then last year, we kept the promises, as the superintendent said, and we backed out a lot of those one-time startup costs. We had a very nominal change to our budget. And then this year, we're going up to 2.6%. So the matrix down below, I basically tried to take some information and break it into the average annual increase over a 2-year, 5-year, or 10-year period, both for tax levy and state aid. And you can see that the state aid is not keeping up with the rest of the budget. However, in the last 2 years, our budget at 1.4% is far below the state average. And even over a 10-year period, our budget has averaged 2.6%, and our tax levy 2.6%, always within the tax cap. So a common question I get is, what happens if the budget doesn't pass? And despite the governor having the executive order that changes the way we are voting this year due to the pandemic, one thing that it's silent on, so therefore the current law stands, is if the voters vote no, technically the board has an option. They can go straight to what's called a contingent budget. They can go out and vote one more time and see if that next budget is approved. That second budget can be the exact same budget. It can be higher, it can be lower. They can do whatever they need to do with it. The hard part is we don't know for sure whether there's really time to be able to do a second vote. As far as what a contingent budget is, the board has some flexibility, but the state does say there's certain types of things that cannot be in a contingent budget and certain types of expenses that must be in a contingent budget. A good example is equipment. If it's not directly tied to health and safety or the preservation of buildings, it cannot be in the budget. Community use of facilities cannot be as part of the budget. So in short, the biggest constraint is the tax levy cannot be more than it was the year before. So in our case, we would have to reduce the budget by almost $3.9 million in order to balance the budget. That would result in a budget that's $244,000 less than the current year's budget. That also means that exclusion to the tax cap, the debt payments, that's no longer treated as an exclusion, and so that would actually reduce programs. So going into some key points, our proposed budget for 2021 is $140,328,172. It's a $3.6 million increase, or 2.66%. Our tax levy, and I'm giving you a little detail or a snapshot of the 8-step formula for the property tax cap. Our operating budget, outside of debt service, if you will, is $101 million and represents 2.3%. So if we didn't have this change in the building aid and the debt payments, our tax cap would be 2.3%. The exclusion amount is an additional 1.5 million or 1.47%, and that's how we get to the 3.76% property tax cap. So therefore, to pass this budget, we need 50% plus one vote to pass. A contingent budget would be $136,445,000 and represent $3,882,000 reduction. Basically, that number is the exact same number that our tax levy increased. So when you receive your ballots at home, you will see the legalese of the resolution for the budget. And this is exactly it. The Board of Education is presenting to the voters a budget of $140,328,172, and that is the maximum spending. That's what the voters are approving. Within a budget, there's a lot of flexibility to be able to move things between codes and make adjustments throughout the year. We have to do that every year. I think our biggest adjustment that we're dealing with right now and the unknowns is the pandemic and what I call the post-pandemic, what we're going to do as we come out of it. Very common to the last several years with the budget. We are also, outside of the general fund budget, we are asking the voters to approve the purchase of buses. We have a capital reserve for bus purchases. That's a savings account for the legal purpose of doing nothing other than buying school buses. We have enough money in that reserve to buy these buses, and we're asking the voters for authorization to withdraw $1.5 million from the reserve to buy these buses. When we buy the buses, it will generate transportation aid, and we take that transportation aid and put it back into the reserve to help replenish it, so it's there to provide use into the future. We are not, unlike some other schools, we are not asking to levy an additional tax to pay for the buses or to issue additional debt, simply to withdraw funds from the savings account. So this is the language that you'll see on the ballot that gets mailed to your home for the purchase of the buses. Again, it will not have a tax rate or tax levy impact.
Thank you, Darrin. As Darrin alluded to, there have been multiple effects and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, directly impacting New York State, directly impacting the Pittsford Central School District, and it certainly has impacted how we do business relative to our voting. The next few slides will provide a brief summary of these changes, specifically discussing the budget vote and election process and the funding of the current and future for 2021 and a little bit beyond. Early in May, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order that modified the rules under which schools can conduct a 2020 annual meeting for the election of school board members and budget votes. Here are some of the key points within that executive order. There is a statewide uniform voting date. School board elections and budget votes originally scheduled for May 19 will now take place on June 9th. The annual budget hearing must be held 7 to 14 days prior to the vote, which puts us in the range of May 26th to June 2nd. This evening is May 26th, and this is the Pittsford Central School District's hearing. Also, there's different orders relative to public notices. Probably the biggest change in this area is that the number of required publications have been reduced from 4 to 2, given the modified time frame. We also are required to send a postcard notice. Those have been mailed out. The postcard notice details the date of the election, the date of the budget hearing, and a definition of a qualified voter. Within our current environment, the manner of voting is certainly different. It's remote, just like our everything we're doing right now has been pretty much remote. So the election of school board members and budget votes will take place remotely. They will all be done by absentee ballots for qualified voters. School districts must send an absentee ballot to all qualified voters with a postage-paid return envelope for any election held on or before June 30th. That is what we are working on. Probably in your homes the next couple days, you'll be receiving your absentee ballots. There will also be instructions for how to request additional ballots should you have more than two qualified voters in your residence. Also, regarding report cards, school districts must submit their report cards to the State Ed Department no later than May 22nd, and the department must take its compilation available electronically at least by June 2nd, 2020, 7 days prior to June 9th. Specific to the board elections, there will be no minimum threshold of signatures required to be placed on the ballot, except they must meet all other requirements, including applicable residency and age. Candidates will be listed on the ballot alphabetically, and then ballots for small city school districts must be set 30 days before the election. Darrin.
So carrying further the governor's executive orders recently, as well as what we know and what we don't know, our current environment for developing a budget, and a budget is a spending plan, and so we're trying to plan for what we know and definitely leave the flexibility for what we don't know. What we know at this time is the governor's enacted budget has 3 measurement periods, in April through May, and then May through June, and again July through December. And the Department of Budget, if the state's financial performance doesn't meet certain standards, such as revenues are more than 1% below projections, or expenditures more than 1% above, the Department of Budget would suggest some changes or reductions to state aid. The legislature has 10 days to adopt or amend that plan, and if they do not respond within the 10 days, the Department of Budget plan automatically goes into effect. The Department of Budget currently is anticipating a $13.3 billion deficit, and we've already gone past the April 30 trigger and even the 10 days of which a decision was supposed to be made, and it's been very, very quiet. Not sure if that's because they're hoping the federal government will provide some additional funds, but to this point we have not received any information on what reductions are forthcoming. The chart below shows the general fund receipts, and this is right from the governor's presentation. And if you look at the 1920 year, pre-pandemic, we already had a deficit situation at the state level. So the pandemic was not necessarily the cause of the deficit, but it's definitely making it worse. So our budget is balanced at this time. We use the enacted state budget, which had a reduction of foundation aid and total state aid, and we knew about these rolling reductions that were forthcoming. We don't know the extent of what the reductions will be, both in total for the entire state. We don't know if the timing will affect the current year's state aid or the 2021 state aid, and we don't know how that reduction will be allocated to schools. Will it be a straight percentage, for example, to all school districts? Will it be somehow adjusted based on wealth, as the formulas normally run? So there's a lot of unknowns with that at this time. So what we do know is shown in the previous slides. We are not as state aid dependent as other school districts. So for once that works in our favor. And basically what that means is there's not as much to take away from us. I've seen a report that shows that if you looked at all the high wealth schools or above average wealth schools in the state and they took all the state away from the schools, it barely made a dent in solving the state deficit problem. It's just simply not where the money is. Unlike New York State, we are in good financial shape. That comes from our audit reports, that comes from Moody Investor Services that looks at our reports and gives us a credit rating, the highest rating we can have, and even straight from the comptroller. We do not have operating deficits. We have 4% of next year's budget in our fund balance, which is the maximum the law provides. As previously discussed, we have reserves, which are savings accounts for specific purposes. We're going to the voters asking to use one of those reserves to buy buses, for example. And we're projecting a surplus for the 19-20 year. Yes, there are some costs because of the pandemic as we operate through the remainder of this year. We also have some savings. We're anticipating a little bit bigger surplus than normal, and we will retain that to help see us through for next year with these reductions as well as the post-pandemic costs. We also know that our community values and has come to expect our programs and services, the electives that we provide, and the enrichment opportunities. They also expect fiscal stability into the future. That's a real challenge because there's so many big unknowns right now, but we're doing everything we can to be able to bridge those unknowns. What we do know continued, we cannot justify taking what we just discussed. We cannot justify, during this time of turmoil, making huge cuts and eliminating programs when we don't know for sure what our target is we're trying to get to. So while we struggle with trying to be responsible and present a budget that takes all these factors into consideration, we just simply don't know what the target is. So our budget serves as a base for us to have flexibility. And our toolbox is we have fund balance and reserves. We have a surplus, as I just mentioned, that we can use to weather the storm. We have retirement attrition. We have other options there that we can try to work with in the future years. We have lessons that we've learned during this time of remote learning, and maybe there's some ways we can deliver programs and services more effectively and efficiently, and not just for Pittsburgh, but throughout the county or throughout the BOCES. The least favorable is mid-year reductions. We're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. We see what that's happening to Rochester schools, and we can do a combination of all of these things. So these are just examples of some of the things we have in our toolbox that we can try to do. We have been preparing for this day for 15 years. No, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, but we've been working for 15 years to set up fund balance and reserves, or as we like to call them, rainy day funds. And I believe we could say it's raining.
Thank you, Darrin. To reiterate, the proposed 2021 budget is balanced. It remains within the property tax cap, and it preserves program and services, not only for the 2021 school year, but it positions our district such that we can recover much quicker should significant cuts come from the state or if the economy does not rebound. The property tax cap is calculated to be a 3.76% increase over the approved 1920 tax levy. The proposed tax levy is 3.76, and it is within the property tax cap. The tax levy increase due to the operating budget is 2.3%. The additional 1.46% per law is an exclusion to the tax levy limit because the voters already approved the debt issuance with the 2003 capital project. The budget illustrates a contained tax levy growth, certainly within the county average, despite the lowest foundation aid per pupil in the county. Would like to close with just a summary of some of the changes in the voting process. I'll leave this up on the screen for a minute so everyone can view it. As a district, we made the decision to mail 2 ballots and 2 postage paid return envelopes with instructions to every Pittsford Central School District household. Residents are asked to return their ballots by mail using the prepaid envelopes. Only 1 ballot per envelope is allowed. All absentee ballots must be received by the district clerk's office by 5 p.m. on June 9th. Eligible voters must meet the following legal requirements: at least 18 years of age, a citizen of the United States, and a legal resident of the district at least 30 days immediately prior to June 9th. Additional ballots may be requested for qualified voters by contacting the district clerk, and you can see her email below. For more information about the 2021 budget and Board of Education candidates, we ask that you do please see the district website. At this point, I would like to turn it over to the Board of Education for any questions. and that will be followed by public comment. Thank you.